This is ethical culture, and I want to dedicate my final talk of this season to a question of ethics. Okay? We sense that American society is in distress in the current era. There's a range of social ills which, in my view, bear something in common. I think we are all struck by the extraordinary increase in what are sometimes referred to as deaths of despair that American society is experiencing. The suicide rate in our country has gone up significantly in the past 2 decades, perhaps most poignantly among teenagers. Death from opioid addiction has reached truly alarming proportions to the point where the average life expectancy in the United States has actually declined. I think that's the first time in our history that reversal has occurred. We all shudder at the perpetuation of violence and mass killings that is at a level with no global equivalent outside of war zones. We just had another one right in Virginia Beach the other day, 12 people murdered the day before yesterday by gun violence. Although it's more difficult to quantify, increasing numbers of Americans report feelings of loneliness, so much so that a recent article in Psychology Today referred to the phenomenon as an epidemic. Depression is surging among Americans. And commensurate with loneliness, depression, and despair, there's been a documented decrease in the number of people involved in civic associations, be it unions, clubs, educational organizations, neighborhood groups, and churches as well. Americans are increasingly alone. Atheists may applaud the decline in church affiliation, which now exceeds 25% of the American population, but on a social level, I am not willing to concede that this is altogether a good thing. I include among the issues I wish to add to these phenomena the increasing privatization of American life, the extraordinary wealth gap that puts extraordinary power into the hands of a few individuals, while the laboring classes and the poor suffer the anxieties of falling through the bottom, or barely staying afloat with crappy, insecure jobs that leave them alone and isolated while the social safety net becomes increasingly frayed. These realities serve as a backdrop for what I want to discuss this morning, and that is at bottom a philosophical question. Namely, what is the place of the individual in society, and the more expansive question of to whom we, as members of society, and moreover as humanists, should feel ourselves accountable. If we were traditional God believers, the answer to this question, in an ultimate sense, would be obvious. We ultimately would be accountable to the Creator, to the Supreme Being who is the author of the universe, to whom we owe our existence. God is the source of all being, including us, and we live our lives in response to His will, which we know through His Word and His commandments. And since for most traditionally religious people, God is the author of morality, when we are acting morally, we are also being accountable to God's will. No doubt, for those who are traditionally religious, they are also accountable to other people, perhaps to their community of believers and to all humankind. But in the final analysis, God claims their highest allegiance, and all accountability funnels back to the Creator. But if our ultimate loyalty is not to God, the situation is somewhat more open-ended. If not God, to whom are we responsible? There are no doubt a good number of responses to this question, which is by no means a trivial one. How we answer it, in great measure, shapes the quality of our lives and, writ large, the nature of our society. How we answer this question stands as at the foundation of the kind of society we want to have and strive politically and otherwise to create. A good place to start is with the individual and our individual selves. In many ways, the modern world is centered on the individual, and a commitment to individualism is a much heralded value of our modern lives. Beyond that, the United States has always put a great premium on individualism, perhaps more so than any other nation, and it is for many a source of national identity and pride. Americans are individuals, staunch individuals. In answering the question of accountability, if we focus on the American experience, perhaps a compelling response should be that we are accountable to ourselves, to our own welfare, our success, our power, and our happiness. Looking out for number one is the colloquial idiom. As an individual, I should be accountable to myself primarily, or maybe, when brought to an extreme, myself alone, at the exclusion of others. Some historians have argued that people as individuals didn't truly exist in the pre-modern world. If one looks at medieval Europe or traditional societies, people's identities were much more grafted into their community, usually religious communities, but also clans, tribes, castes, guilds, social classes, and where you were situated in the social hierarchy. Asserting oneself as distinct from others or striving for individual achievement was not especially valued and not part of one's sense of self. Embeddedness in group values and sharing the myths of the group and practices is how people lived out their lives. Conformity and performing prescribed duties as well as obligations to authorities was assuredly more in evidence than expressions of individual freedom, personal striving, achievement, and aggrandizement. Aggrandizement, again, as individual men and women. Excuse me. This historical interpretation, I think, however, has been somewhat overstated. We find descriptions of distinct individual personalities even in the Bible. But I think it is the case that the heavy emphasis placed on individualism, such as we witness in contemporary America, is something that does not emerge until modern times. Somewhere around the 16th century, or maybe a bit earlier, we see evidence of the sketching of individual persons in art, poetry, literature, and then somewhat later, certainly in the domain of political thinking. It is sometimes said that the novel is a distinctly modern literary form, and it is not coincidental that among the first novels written was Robinson Crusoe, which depicts an individual living alone on an island and outside of society. A book like that could not have been written in the 12th century. It had to await the emergence of the individual, and the novel is a particularly modern form of literature. But focusing on the individual and his or her interests is a good place to start for obvious reasons. Each individual, of course, is the center of his or her own life experience. It is where we experience and interpret our world. When pain is inflicted on us, it is we as individuals who suffer. It is our own subjective individual experience that makes all the difference. And it is our own individual life, with perhaps a few extraordinary exceptions, that we value more than anything else. We may be extraordinarily rich, powerful, popular, and successful. We may win honor and fame directed upon us by other people. We may be objectively extolled as being a great person and having everything going for us. But if, for whatever reasons, we psychologically feel ourselves to be unhappy, miserable, and worthless, that subjective individual sense of ourselves trumps all other validation we receive from the external world. It doesn't make any difference if we feel subjectively as individuals that our lives are worthless. Our individual selves are the seat of our experience, and we are fated to live out our lives from the inside out, so to speak. And if we are miserable, how the world beyond us evaluates us makes little or no difference in the final analysis. And of course, our death will be ours and ours alone, which is a thought that often sits with us uncomfortably. But to my way of thinking, we can think of individualism and our individual self in two ways. Individualism, as I have come to understand it, has two employments, so to speak. One way is political, and the other way is social. There's a way of thinking about individualism in a political sense and in a social sense. In other words, the individual and individualism is a twofold concept. Let me begin with a political formulation of the individual. I think that appreciation for the importance of subjectivity in the 17th and 18th century gave rise to a growing appreciation of the importance of the individual. Individualism as a way of understanding the place in society, and to a philosophy, certainly, of individual rights, which has become the basis for modern democracy. The historian Lynn Hunt has a very interesting thesis in this regard. She thinks one of the factors that gave rise to the appreciation of the individual emerged primarily in France, when upper-class women and men developed a widespread interest in reading novels, which dealt with the lives, including the inner lives of people much different from themselves, such as paupers, young girls, and foreigners. It was the development of what she calls the epistolary novel in the late 18th century, which was very much in vogue in that period in France. For the first time through reading these novels, people became acquainted with the humanity of others, and this spurred, and the inner lives of others. And this spurred an appreciation for their lives, their subjectivity, and their personalities as individuals. This, in turn, gave rise to the idea that individuals possess rights as individuals, today what we would call human rights. This idea is of greatest importance. In modern political theory, it is the individual who is the possessor of rights. What this means most of all is that the individual is protected from and is immune to control, oppression, coercion, and violation by others, especially the state and its government, whose power compared to the individual is overwhelmingly great. For Lynn Hunt, the paradigmatic human right is the freedom and protection of the individual from being tortured, especially by the state. She sees that as the premier human right that develops in this period. And historically, this is very interesting. Up until the middle of the 18th century in France, torture was an established and totally acceptable practice in the French judicial system. Nobody had any qualms about torturing people who were suspected of crimes. Okay, there was no sense that this was infliction of cruelty, no compassion for those who in effect got caught up in the judicial system and were subjected to torture. It was a form of inquiry, okay, to basically get at the truth and at confessions. If the state sought a confession from a suspect, it was routine, I said, and accepted practice to torture him on the grounds that, on the assumption that the body in pain could not lie. But within a short span of about 20 years, sensibilities radically changed, and thinking about this totally flipped, with the result that torture was banished from the French judicial system. If you read Voltaire, who was the great luminary of the French Enlightenment, early in his career, he supports and defends torture. But in later decades of his life, he becomes totally opposed to it. It was in that period, a lot of people wrote of it. Actually, this should make Italians very proud. The foremost thinker in this person was in this regard was an Italian exponent of the Enlightenment by the name of Cesare Beccaria, who wrote a seminal text on punishments. And he basically argues in the 18th century against the death penalty and against the employment of torture. And that really that was part of modern thinking, a part of the Enlightenment that had tremendous influence. And it's the reason why, when our founders created the Bill of Rights, they ensured that the Eighth Amendment, okay, bars cruel and unusual punishment. That comes out of that period, of that tradition, especially including the French experience and Cesare Beccaria's writing on cruelty and punishment. Very interesting, and it flipped very, very, very quickly in that era. It has to do with, again, the discovery of the individual, an appreciation for the subjectivity of other human beings, and so on and so forth. It gives rise to this notion of rights and protections. To put this concept into positive terms, the idea of the individual that goes along with the individual possessing rights is that the individual is a free, autonomous agent who possesses the liberty to direct her or his life as she pleases. Each person possesses freedom and agency, uncoerced by the state or by others or by society. And in this freedom is vested the person's dignity. Okay. As the 19th century philosopher of liberty, John Stuart Mill, so nicely put it, quote, "Each man should be free to pursue his own plan of life." Okay, we are free. We are autonomous individuals and agents. That's a modern idea, and one that we live by. We all take that for granted. Right? What this implies is that rather than being absorbed into society, the individual in her freedom stands somewhat apart from society, outside of society, and has the freedom and agency, as Spinoza stated at the dawn of the modern era, quote, "to think what he wants and to do what he thinks." That's a very nice formulation of freedom. To think what you want and to do what you think. Okay, nice, very nice freedom. Again, a modern sensibility about the human individual, his or her agency, freedom to basically think what he wants and do what he thinks. These ideas need to be cherished, upheld, and defended, I think, with the greatest militancy. Because it is in this idea of the individual and individual rights that our freedom and democracy rests, as well as a commitment to equality. It is the basis of our civil liberties. If we lose this defense of the individual in the political sense, then we are paving the way for oppression and tyranny. Okay. Perhaps no society, no nation has appropriated this modern invention of individualism and taken it to greater extremes than the United States. It lies at the heart of the American spirit and presupposes a particular way of life that implies a whole set of values. You know, I like to say to my human rights students when I teach at Columbia that when it comes to, and we don't realize this, when it comes to the right of free speech, for example, the United States stands alone in the world community. We are an outlier. We give a much broader range, a considerably broader range, I should say, to free speech than do the European countries or any other country. We do not have a notion, as does Canada and Europe, have a notion of preemptive hate speech. Okay, I can stand up in the United States in front of a mob and excoriate in the worst possible disgusting terms a minority, right, at a rally, and that is perfectly protected speech. I cannot do that in European society. I cannot do that in Canada. I will be taken away in handcuffs. The United States has this very broad, sort of proud, honored tradition of giving the widest berth, not without qualification in some cases, but wide berth. It's also true in terms of religious, my goodness, religious freedom in this country. We bend over backwards in this country to give an extraordinary amount of freedom to behaviors done in the name of religion, so much so that if you have a religious rationale for a particular behavior, you will basically not be held, you will be held harmless for certain things that if you did exactly the same behavior out of a secular, non-religious rationale, you could be arrested and punished for it. I mean, we have given a tremendous range of birth to certain types of freedoms, particularly, I think some of it goes overboard, particularly to religion and to freedom of speech. It's part of American individualism, okay, that lies at the heart of it. Okay, but there are derivative values, that evolve from this understanding of the individual and his or her relationship to society that begin to shade into what I refer to as the social appreciation or employment of individualism, some which, especially if brought to an extreme, may conflict with other very important values, and in fact may not be so attractive. And I need to talk about that aspect of individualism. Let me give some examples. The idea of the individual does imply to varying degrees that the individual person stands outside of society and in a certain sense stands against society. This can be construed, in fact, as a zero-sum game. What society gains comes at the expense of the individual, and what the individual gains comes at the expense of society. Such a notion of the individual can imply that I am totally sovereign over my own life and I can do as I please with it as long as I'm not hurting anybody else. In short, my sole allegiance is to myself, and if taken to an extreme, I owe nothing to society or to anyone else. This concept of the individual is the basis of what we refer to as libertarianism. I suspect in many of its applications, people such as ourselves support such a libertarian view of the individual. When it comes, for example, to the heated issue of abortion, I suspect many advocates of a woman's right to choose would adopt the position that a woman's body belongs to her individual self alone and does not belong to society, the state, or to the fetus. Many would support the law just enacted, to give another example, in New Jersey, which allows for physician-assisted suicide under certain stringent conditions. At bottom, the right to suicide is based on the notion that an individual's life and her choice to end it belongs to the individual alone, and not to society, the state, her family, or to God. Likewise, we would invoke individual rights, as I've indicated, when it comes to speech, with few exceptions to religious conscience. We'd invoke this liberty to be free of slavery or of torture, and to a range of other immunities that individuals hold against society and the state. Here, many of us would concur, I think, I'd certainly do, with the libertarian position rooted in a stark and absolute, or almost absolute sense of individualism. As a matter of rights, the person is accountable only to himself or to herself. But I suspect that when it comes to issues pertaining, okay, and here I'm talking to this group, when it comes to issues pertaining to the economy, we very same people begin to have lots of problems with the unfettered, sovereign individual whose only allegiance or accountability is primarily or only to oneself. We know through painful experience where this application of individualism as it pertains to the market leads. It leads inevitably to a privileged few becoming extraordinarily wealthy and powerful, while the vast majority grow increasingly impoverished. Free market, laissez-faire capitalism, which places individualism at the center, is a powerful engine in creating great wealth, but capitalism inevitably kills around the edges, okay? I mean, unfettered capitalism without regulation, coercion by the state, that limits individual, accumulation of wealth is something I think, as much as we may herald individual freedom in certain ways, when it comes to the economy, I think maybe individualism needs to be crimped, needs to be restrained, highly qualified, and so forth. Okay, this reality opens the door to what I'm referring to as individualism in the social sense. So far I've been talking about it in its political manifestations. While we need to defend individualism as a basis for individual political rights as militantly as we can, individualism in the social sense, what I would call radical individualism, I think is very problematic. True enough, America often glorifies the individual socially. The classic case is the icon of the stoic cowboy who rides alone and often engages in heroic adventures. Or Americans often point to pride to the American genius, creativity, and inventiveness that emerges from the freedom vested in individuals to pursue their dreams. Although I would contend that the praise of individual creativity, American creativity, is often based in a fiction, in the sense that American individual accomplishment often rests, in fact, on social contributions made by others and springs from the social soil in which the individual is rooted. Barack Obama, okay, somewhat controversially, it got him into a little bit of trouble, eloquently pointed to this fiction of the heroic American individual and their creativity and genius and so on and so forth, and basically pointed to what, in effect, is the hidden nature behind what we often see as ostensibly individual creativity and accomplishment. He did this when he was running for the first time around, okay, when he was campaigning in his first campaign for about 2012, right, for the presidency. He stated the following, okay, and his speech was misunderstood. It was seen as an attack on business, but that's not what he meant. He was making a philosophical statement, and Barack Obama, I should say, is one of just a handful of presidents who was a true intellectual. I mean, he tried to root his policy, didn't often talk explicitly about it, but he was very learned philosophically, and did try to root his policy, for better or worse, in a basis of philosophical ideas that he took very seriously. And he was trying to bring that to light in the following statement. He said the following: there was nobody in this country who got rich on his own. Nobody. Okay. You built a factory out there. Good for you. But I want to be clear, you moved your goods to market on the roads the rest of us paid for. You hired workers the rest of us paid to educate. You were safe in your factory because of police forces and fire forces that the rest of us paid for. You didn't have to worry that marauding bands would come and seize everything at your factory and hire someone to protect against this because of the work the rest of us did. Now look, you built a factory and it turned into something terrific or a great idea, God bless. Keep a big hunk of it. But part of the underlying social contract is you took a hunk of that, and that you take a hunk of that and pay forward for the next kid who comes along. That's a profound statement. What he's trying to say is that behind individual accomplishment is a whole network of social and society support. Okay, and again, conservatives took him to task because they heard an anti-business message in this. That was not his point. He was making a philosophical point about ostensible individual achievement and what lies at the base of it. Okay, but the negative side of radical individualism becomes clear by invoking several extreme cases. Sometimes you have to give extreme cases in order to try to clarify what you're getting at. If I'm a radical individualist and thereby feel that I am accountable to no one by myself, this might lead to a situation, for example, in which I am walking along see a small child drowning in a shallow pool, and do absolutely nothing to save him on the grounds that we are all individuals, we owe nothing to anyone but ourselves, and if I walk on by and do nothing, so be it. In a legal sense, I may be within my rights, in that there is no law that forces me to be a good Samaritan. But in a moral sense, I think we would conclude that such a person was morally deficient or depraved to let the child drown because he felt no accountability to the welfare of the child, or because he had just had his pants dry cleaned and didn't want to get them wet, okay? But a stark radical individualism might defend that type of behavior. Individualism, seen from this perspective, concludes that we are as individuals totally separate from other human beings. We are exclusively responsible only to and for ourselves alone, and we survive or thrive based on our individual power, privilege, luck, or perhaps on our cunning, aggression, ruthlessness, competitive instincts, or unbridled egotism. Such radical individualism portrays the individual as standing alone in a world and society which are essentially hostile and competitive and combative, what the philosopher Thomas Hobbes referred to as a war of each against all. Moreover, it is also a formula, I think, for isolation and loneliness. Raise this value, this portrayal, to the level of society, and in my view, we get to see where I think America in the current era is ominously moving, towards individuals alone. It is a philosophy of the individual and society which I personally reject, even as I again defend the rights of the individual in a political sense. Rather, I see the individual as not standing alone, but deeply embedded in social environments, in families, in communities, both those into which we are born and those which are created, and those that are identified with the institutional frameworks which are part and parcel of society, such as the workplace, schools, and other organizations that we are part of or choose to join. In short, we live our lives in a web of social relations, and we are profoundly dependent on other people and society as a whole, including those generations that came before us. Examples of this dependence or interdependence are endless. No individual, for example, and it should be obvious, but nobody thinks about these things, no individual had to invent the language that he or she speaks. Okay, you do not have to invent the language that you speak. It was handed down to us as an endowment or a gift from the linguistic culture into which we were born. We are proud of the values we hold and espouse, and cherish them as a product of our own experience, our intelligence, and maybe even our original thinking. We're geniuses. But this conclusion is, in great measure, a product, I think, of blind egoism. The apple, in fact, doesn't fall very far from the tree. You begin to realize that when you get older, it's sort of an unpleasant realization. You know, as a kid, you think you're so smart, and then you realize, I'm beginning to look like my father. I mean, but the truth is, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, and the values we hold are greatly molded, I think, by the culture we inhabit, the family we're born into, and the values of those other people whom we are exposed to, who help socialize us. Just think of it, if we were born, it's a matter of chance. If we were born into a different culture and in a different time and place, we would think very differently. We'd be very different people with different values and different ideas, right? Socially speaking, our individual selves, I think, are like the tip of the iceberg. Beneath the surface, which is the mass of the iceberg, beneath the surface is the funded endowments of society we receive and rest upon. And what in fact is distinctive to us as individuals is, for the most part, taking what comes from others and perhaps rearranging it in our own way, which may in fact be distinctive. Okay, I'll grant that. Much of who we are, in other words, is an internalization of what we've gotten from others. We are individuals, yes, but also social creatures at the same time, and I would say primarily, biologically, culturally, psychologically, and in many other ways. That which is individually unique to us, of course, needs to be cherished, reverenced, and respected. But I would argue, it constitutes a very small fraction what makes us up. As the poet John Donne remarked, quote, "No man is an island," and I believe this is pervasively true. Rather than see the individual as separate from society, I would argue in a social sense that without community, without others, there in fact can be no individual. It is my view that our individuality in fact is forged out of active engagement with others and active engagement with communities. Becoming who we are is a process. It's a dynamic social activity, okay? Activity. Likewise, I would argue that while in the political sense the individual is free, in a social sense there can actually be no freedom outside of society and the conditions within which the person lives out his or her life. Being free has a great deal to do with my ability to exercise my capacities, my powers, my strengths, my abilities. But if society has relegated me, for example, to abject poverty or deprives me of an education, my freedom is greatly thereby curtailed. My freedom exists within society and is not a condition that is aloof or independent from society. It is always tagged, in a way, to the social matrix in some sense. When it comes to the question of to whom I am responsible, to whom I am accountable, I would argue that by virtue of our social natures, just as we inhabit a web of social relations, so we morally inhabit a web of moral obligation. I believe in what the Harvard political philosopher Michael Sandel refers to as the encumbered self. I believe in what I refer to as associative obligations. In other words, every relationship I inhabit comes with incumbent duties to others. Parents have obligations to their children, children to their parents, employers to their employees, and employees to their employers and co-workers. Friends have obligations to friends, governments to their citizens, and citizens to their government. And in the widest circle, human beings to other human beings, both those who are known to us and to strangers as well. And even beyond the human realm, especially urgent in our times, I believe we have a responsibility to nature and to the natural environment which has given us life, sustains us, and on which we are dependent. This may take us into dabbling with a spiritual sensibility of sorts, but that I don't think is necessarily objectionable. In fact, I think it's rather nice and something that is uplifting. I love this time of year. I was outdoors working on my platform address yesterday. Believe me, I was going to not sit inside. I have a forest in my backyard, and I feel a communion. I mean, this gets a little sappy, right? But I feel a communion, I feel a communion with the trees. I love these. I have the oldest trees in Bergen County are in my backyard. They're 250 years old. They're huge, okay? They're venerable. And like me, they are living things. Okay, and trees, by the way, are responsive to their environments. I'm not saying they're conscious. I'm not saying they're reflective. Okay, but they are responsive. Okay, to their environments, and I do feel a type of appreciation, a type of communion. Okay, with my backyard, with my trees, and so on and so forth, and beyond that. And and again, you may say it's a flight of the imagination. But it is, in effect, a type of relationship, and I feel protected of it, and so on and so forth. Anyway, go on. That's a different talk, but you get the point. I mean, I'm talking about obligation, and I think we have obligation. And and that's a discussion within environmentalism. Do we protect the environment ultimately in order to preserve humankind, or do we protect it because nature itself intrinsically makes a claim on us? Okay, that's an interesting philosophical discussion about the basis of an environmental ethic. Okay, is it ultimately self-serving for the human species, or is there an actually objective intrinsic claim that nature places on us to respond to it in a particular way? We don't have to answer that today, but it's an interesting question. But I feel that sense of obligation. I feel, all right, look, I'm getting off on that. Let me come back to the human realm, okay? Get away from trees, okay? Before concluding, however, I want to get into something that's a little more difficult, but I think follows from this sense of social obligation that I'm talking about. It basically speaks against radical individualism. I want to take this notion of social obligation one step further, even beyond the bounds of classical liberal thought, which we're most comfortable with. Okay? The political idea of individualism, individual rights, contains within it the central idea of freedom. Okay? The individual is a free agent, and this bears on the notion of responsibility. Most of us would conclude, I think, that a person can only be or should only be held responsible for acts or behaviors that he himself has chosen to undertake and has consented to. I want you to listen very carefully, okay? It seems morally wrong, indeed very wrong, to hold a person at all responsible for acts which he himself has not done or which someone else has done, okay? Indeed, all of us would strenuously protest, I think, if we were held responsible for something we did not do, all right? This conclusion follows directly from the idea of the person as an individual who indeed is free to consent or not consent to make choices as to what they take on and so on and so forth. But if we conclude, as I do, that we are social beings and that much of who we are is the inheritance we receive from others, maybe this conclusion is not quite so certain. Indeed, one of the great moral and political issues that confronts us at this moment raises this very question of where to draw the line of responsibility and what we, and I could be talking to the people in this room, what we are responsible for. And that question is illuminated by the reality that we are all products of particular communities, again, which shape us, with whom we share common values, and we partake in common narratives that mold our identities. And to the extent that they do, they may justifiably claim our loyalty. Let me give the stark example of where I'm leading. Assuredly, the most intimate community, so to speak, that claims our loyalty is our family. Okay? It is important to note that families are communities that we did not consent to belong to. Okay, we were born, nobody chooses their parents. Okay, we were born into particular families, but we feel loyalty to our family. So for example, let's talk about drowning children again. Let's assume I come upon two drowning children, one of whom is my own child, and the other is the child of a stranger, okay? But I can physically save only one of them. That's the condition, the dilemma that I confront. Few people would argue that I should respond on the basis of a dispassionate commitment to fairness, which is a good liberal idea, a dispassionate commitment to fairness, and flip a coin in order to decide which child I would save. Okay? A stark fairness would require that, right? Or something like that. And few, I think, would find fault with my choosing to save my own child, recognizing that parents have a special bond of loyalty to their children that they do not have to others. Or one might conclude that I am responsible, this is more realistic perhaps, one might conclude that I am responsible to care for my aging parent and not any aging parent, even though consent cannot fully justify why this is so, okay, why this commitment is so. I certainly did not choose my parents. In other words, we can be responsible for things for which our choice was not at issue, in this case being the child of a particular parent. The fact that my consent was not involved, in other words, does not free me from being responsible. One might argue that in taking care of that parent, you could argue, in a more liberal vein, that I am in effect giving back what was earlier given to me by my parent. But the counter-argument to that is that even if my parent was particularly unkind or neglectful to me as a child, my responsibility to my mother or father still pertains by virtue of the loyalty that is inherent in the family bond, which transcends the issue of consent and voluntary choice. Am I making this clear in terms of, right, what this situation? Okay, now, let's broaden the community and the loyalty that ostensibly goes with it from the family to the community of the nation. These loyalties and narratives and the encumbered responsibilities they entail that emerge from communities I belong to may even extend across generations. And I'm going to bring this to a current issue. Stuff is more than just abstract. It's a very real issue we confront at this moment. Let's look at the responsibility that the citizens of a nation have to historical injustices. One can ask the question, especially at a time when we painfully see a reemergence of right-wing nationalism and anti-Semitism in Germany, as to whether German citizens today bear responsibility to the Jewish population in their midst, which has now grown to about 200,000 Jews living in Germany, to the responsibility to the Jewish population in their midst for the perpetration of the Holocaust and the systematic murder of 6 million Jews, even though those atrocities were committed before the citizens of Germany today were born. Okay. Moral individuals would say no, that contemporary Germans have no responsibility to Jews in their midst. Those who played no role in the Holocaust themselves did not commit those crimes, have no responsibility whatsoever for what they themselves did not do. And this response does have, philosophically, a compelling character. You could argue that position. But I am not sure that that answer is so clear or indeed correct. This position of moral individualism presupposes that the self is detachable from the community from which the person derives his identity. The Germans of today share a common culture, a common historical lineage, and therefore, in some way, a solidarity with their German ancestors who did perpetrate those atrocities. The Germans of today are embedded in a continuous German narrative, so to speak. They certainly cannot be blamed for the acts themselves, but that does not mean that as part of the German people and inheritors of the past, they have no responsibility for the way in which they relate to Jews in Germany today. To disavow any moral responsibility at all seems to me, in my opinion, to be morally just too thin. Okay. You may see where this is going. Okay. In the American context, the issue of reparations for the African American community, which endured 400 years of slavery and institutionalized racism, is not new, but it has emerged again in this moment as a matter of contemporary debate. It is again certainly on the agenda, and behind it is the same moral dilemma, the same philosophical question about accountability and its reach. Okay. In 2008, in fact, I read with quite interest, this was new to me, or I didn't recall it. In 2008, the New Jersey legislature, in fact, debated whether it should issue a formal apology. An apology implies responsibility, a formal apology for slavery. And a Republican assemblyman asked, quote, "Who living today is guilty of slaveholding and thus capable of apologizing for the offense?" Okay? He obviously thought no one. Okay, saying, in effect, going on to say, today's residents of New Jersey, even those who can trace their ancestry back to slaveholders, bear no collective guilt or responsibility for unjust events in which they personally played no role. End quote. Got it? This, again, is the position of moral individualism. But in my opinion, it's problematic. The injustices which are a legacy of slavery, in fact, continue. And the white population of the society continues to reap the benefits which 400 years of oppressing and plundering the black population of America have brought. It is not for the people of Thailand or Italy or Turkey to apologize for the slavery of African Americans or to work out a program of reparations. It is not their history. It is not their narrative. But it is ours. And it feels irresponsible for Americans of today to detach themselves from that history and its tragic legacy. We are not to be blamed, let me be clear, for acts that we ourselves did not commit. But that doesn't mean that we today do not bear some responsibility for what our fellow Americans of the past, in fact, perpetrated. Again, we share with them a common narrative, a living historical legacy, and as a nation, arguably, a common community. Okay? And that generates, I would argue, a responsibility, even though we are not the perpetrators of those atrocities. I hope I'm making it clear. Okay. In closing, I want to return to what is the guiding question of this exploration, which is put forward in my title. Is it about me, or is it about us? Okay? Certainly, as individuals, we need to look after ourselves, our own welfare, the realization of our potentials, our aspirations, and our dreams. There is no virtue in selling ourselves short or in self-denial. And we all have a right to defend our liberty, pursue our happiness, and assert ourselves in the world. We certainly do. But in some sense, the question and the dichotomy that I raise that it suggests is a false one. It is my view that we are for ourselves when we are for others. It is my view that we become our best selves by committing ourselves to higher dedications, to peoples and purposes beyond our immediate individual self-interest. Our society, I have long believed, has suffered from an excess of pursuits focused disproportionately on the magnification of the individual self, whether it be an obsession with materialism, wealth, consumerism, personal power, public acclaim, and aggrandizement, much of which has led us down the road, I believe, for loneliness and for far too many despairs. And our society, spurred by a reprehensible wealth gap, suffers from the socially destructive momentum of privatization. The wealthy can separate themselves as individuals from the rest of us through private schools, private security services, private clubs, private transportation if they own 3 cars, and live behind private walls in gated communities, all of which ensures that public institutions erode and people leading different lives never encounter each other. This eviscerates, I think, a sense of a common community and a peoplehood, and destroys the matrix in which civic virtue is nurtured. In short, it helps hasten the demise of democracy. Therefore, let me say as my last word, what's needed, I believe, is an uplifting ethic that will take to heart the humanity of the other, and a vision that on this small planet we all share a common destiny, and that we need to dedicate ourselves as best we can and however we can to the common good.